Ark of the Covenant was sacred. It contained God's 10 commandments.
The Ark was the most significant object that has ever existed on the face of the earth.
The Bible tells of its extreme power.
Fiery sparks would emerge.
People would die if they touched it.
God made his power manifest through the Ark.
It was his throne on earth.
Yet the Ark has been lost for over 2,500 years. Gone, but not forgotten.
The Ark exists today. It is somewhere.
Where is it now? That's the million-dollar question.
Over the ages, men have hunted for the Ark in Egypt, in the Arabian desert, or even in Ethiopia.
It's like looking for a needle in the haystack.
But one man claimed to have found it in Jerusalem.
He pointed out where he believed it was.
Was he a charlatan, or as he believed, an instrument of God?
God led us right to it.
Ron Wyatt said he saw the Ark of the Covenant with his own eyes and lived to tell the tale. Ron Wyatt was from Kentucky, a poor but God-fearing state in America's Bible Belt.
He came from a very large family that lived in rural Kentucky in the mountains. Much poverty, not much of a chance in life. He had to leave home when he was either 12 or 13.
What Ron knew of the ancient Middle East came from reading the Bible. He was drawn to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, a devout Christian sect where Bible study is a lifetime pursuit. A habit he instilled in his own children, a daughter and 2 sons. Michelle is the eldest and attends this Seventh-day Adventist church near Nashville every Sabbath.
Dad was raised that way his whole life, and we were our entire lives also.
His youngest son was named after him, Ron Wyatt Jr.
We were raised Seventh-day Adventists, fairly strict. I mean, you know, we had to go to church, had to go to Sabbath school.
Seventh-day Adventists believe that the Bible is the Word of God and historically accurate.
You have your Bible class, so you go through there and you study all the different stories in there about David and Moses.
There was something else you saw out there about what Jesus gave to us, and that is the little stars.
At home, every evening we had worship. So we had Bible books, like children's story books, and Dad would read us a story every night. So we got to take turns sitting on his lap while he held the book and read the book. So we were raised our whole lives to believe all of that's true.
So we were always raised up knowing the Bible, no doubt that it's the truth. That's, to us, it was fact.
Ron Wyatt worked in a Tennessee hospital as a nurse anesthetist, but age 44, he made a life-changing decision to prove that the stories of the Bible are true. Loaded up with equipment, including an 8mm cine camera, Ron and his 2 sons, Danny and Ronnie, set off for the foothills of Mount Ararat in Turkey, looking for Noah's Ark. And in a boat-shaped rocky outcrop, they thought they'd found it.
My dad was quite sure that that was Noah's Ark because it's the only boat-shaped object way up in a mountain range in Turkey.
Right here is a piece of Noah's Ark. It's petrified wood, and we found this right up on top of the boat-shaped object.
The next Bible story Ron Wyatt decided to prove true was the parting of the Red Sea. So in 1978, after sub-aqua training in a Nashville swimming pool, Ron and the boys went diving in the Red Sea. They were searching for Egyptian chariot parts to prove Pharaoh's army pursuing Moses and the Israelites had been swallowed up as the parted Red Sea collapsed. The Wyatts were inexperienced in both diving and archaeology, but as soon as they started searching, they found what they were looking for.
Me and my brother saw a chariot wheel, and we saw the back of a chariot turned upside down.
And I found a golden chariot wheel. My dad figured later may have been the Pharaoh's chariot. I did take a picture of it, but that camera did drown, unfortunately.
But Ron's apparently successful search in the Red Sea was suddenly interrupted. Ron had severe sunburn and was unable to continue. As he was convalescing, he went sightseeing in Jerusalem with Danny and Ronnie, when something very odd happened. Ron suddenly stopped walking. He raised his arm. His hand pointed to a derelict area. When he spoke, his voice sounded strange.
There is Jeremiah's grotto, and the Ark of the Covenant is in there.
I'd never heard him mention Jeremiah's grotto. So that surprised him because he was saying, man, I don't know how I said that or why, but that came out of my mouth.
Ron was convinced that God was speaking to him, guiding him to his greatest discovery of all.
Ron really believed that God was leading him to look for the Ark of the Covenant.
Ron had no idea then that the search for the greatest of all biblical treasures would soon come to dominate his life. But what was the Ark, and why was it so important?
The Ark was the receptacle in which the most important items that ever existed in the world resided, namely the Ten Commandments.
In the Bible, the book of Exodus tells how Moses leads the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and through the wilderness to Mount Sinai.
As the story goes, when Moses went up to Mount Sinai, he stays there 40 days and 40 nights without eating and without drinking, and then he received from God 2 stone tablets, and the Ten Commandments was inscribed with the finger of God. So it was really an object, created by God, something that came as a gift from a supernatural power.
The importance of the Ten Commandments cannot be overstated, not for how they were written, but what was written on them, God's law. They would become the foundation of Western morality. They are instructions of what must be done.
Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy.
And what must not be done.
Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal.
The commandments were one half of a covenant, a bargain with God. If the people kept his law, he would be their God and deliver them to the promised land.
A covenant is a two-way agreement. Both sides have responsibility. So God took upon himself the responsibility to preserve the Jewish nation.
The Bible says that God commanded Moses to build a container to keep the commandments in. This was the Ark. Reading his Bible, Ron would find a clear description of what it might actually look like.
They shall make an ark of acacia wood. 2 cubits and a half shall be its length, 1 cubit and a half its breadth, and 1 cubit and a half its height.
A cubit is about half a meter. So the ark was 1 meter long, half a meter wide, and half a meter tall. Small, but exquisitely beautiful.
You shall overlay it with pure gold. Inside and outside shall you overlay it, and you shall make on it a moulding of gold around it.
Most memorably, God's specification included on the lid of the ark 2 golden statuettes of winged celestial beings, cherubim.
You shall make a mercy seat of pure gold, and you shall make 2 cherubim of gold.
The Bible describes not just a beautiful, grand container for the 10 Commandments. It was so much more. The lid between the 2 golden cherubim was the seat of God himself.
The cherubim were absolutely remarkable because the presence of God emerged from between the 2 cherubs.
And this is the most important part of all. Legend has it that the ark was a dwelling place for God on earth, dispensing wisdom and unlimited power.
And this was where his presence came down and dwelt. It was his throne on earth. People would die if they touched it because of the glory of God that no human can survive.
As the ark was being carried towards Jerusalem, a man by the name of Uzzah wished to steady it, and because he touched the ark, he dropped down dead.
The ark was described as being an object of immense power, and we get depictions such as in the Indiana Jones movie, where uncovering it unleashed this unspeakable power.
Such was the power of the ark that the Israelites carried it on poles before their advancing army.
The Bible tells us about the usage of the ark. The ark was taken into battle as a symbol of the power of God and the fact that God would be with them as they fought.
But it was not just a weapon. The Bible tells how the ark eased the Israelites' path to the Promised Land.
We're told how the ark was carried through the waters of the River Jordan as the nation was entering into the Holy Land, and thanks to the presence of the ark, miraculously the nation was able to walk on dry land. It's not the ark that has the power, but rather it's the power of God which is manifest through the ark.
Around 3,000 years ago, the ark found a permanent home when King David at last settled the Israelites in Jerusalem. The Bible says David's son, King Solomon, built a great temple on a hill. The ark was to take its permanent place in Jewish ritual deep inside, in a place called the Holy of Holies.
Once a year, on the holy day of Yom Kippurim, the Day of Atonement, the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies. That was the only day of the year in which he would enter into the holiest place on earth in order to pray alongside the ark.
It's one of the world's great mysteries that this most holy object not only disappeared from view, but vanished altogether.
When Solomon builds the temple, we know where it went, in the Holy of Holies, in the back room of the temple. But at some point, the Bible stops talking about the ark.
What happened to it, and where is it now? These 2 questions have obsessed countless generations. There have been many stories over the centuries about what happened to the Ark. Adventurers have hunted as far afield as Egypt and Africa, yet it has never been found. The most popular theory is that the Ark was lost in Jerusalem itself, in a cataclysmic invasion.
The destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in the early part of the 6th century BC is described in the Bible. It's described in the records of the Babylonians and by archaeology.
Ron Wyatt learned that after Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians in 586 BC, nothing more is heard of the Ark. Did the Babylonians take it or destroy it? If they had, surely there would be a historical record of it. They would have boasted about it. The Jews would have lamented it, chronicled it. So if the Babylonians didn't take it away or destroy it, what did happen to it? Ron decided the clue lay in his involuntary words. But who was Jeremiah?
Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah from the village of Anatot, was one of the three great prophets of our people, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And he had the tragic responsibility for preparing the people for the destruction of the temple.
Jeremiah was a priest in Solomon's temple, and his duty, having foreseen the danger, was to protect the Ark. Did he have anything to do with its disappearance?
There is one source, the book of 2nd Maccabees, that says that Jeremiah took the Ark and hid it from the Babylonians before the city was destroyed. Now, this is a book that's not in most editions of the Bible today. It's from what we call the Apocrypha.
The prophet Jeremiah, being warned of God, commanded the tabernacle and the ark to go with him. He found a hollow cave wherein he laid the tabernacle and the ark and the altar of incense, and so stopped the door.
The second book of Maccabees also relates that no sooner had Jeremiah's workers sealed the Ark in the cave than they miraculously lost all idea of where it was. The Ark was safe from destruction, but lost. So when Ron voiced the words, "There's Jeremiah's grotto," was he actually indicating the location of the cave where the Ark was hidden? In January 1979, Ron Wyatt had saved enough of his hospital wages to return to Jerusalem. With his sons, Danny and Ronnie, he began his quest to unearth the Ark of the Covenant. But as their own film footage shows, the area he had pointed to looked very inauspicious. It was a rubbish dump.
When we first started digging, there was a dead cat in there and trash. Me and my dad were the first two in there, and we were digging in a lot of dust.
We're in real soft ash-like stuff. It's just real soft. Digging down, I got a big cave in on me, and it kind of got me up to about here. I couldn't hardly move, but my head was out. I could breathe, but it just kind of trapped me there, so they had to dig me out of that.
Ron wasn't one to let a lack of training or experience hamper his quest for the Ark.
We weren't shoring up the cave as we dug it at all. We weren't putting boards over our heads or shoring anything up.
I'd never dug a hole like that before. We were lucky we didn't bury ourselves, probably. Yeah, not the smartest thing.
There are things that could have collapsed on us at any time. It was very dangerous.
Although the Wyatts were inexperienced, they were also lucky. No one was injured, but it seemed their luck had run out when they hit a serious problem.
We were digging along the outside and we broke into the mountain and cleared out a bunch of rock from in there and started digging inside the mountain.
Now, their work stalled. Instead of finding Jeremiah's grotto and the Ark, they faced a wall of solid rock.
Once you get past all the loose dirt, it became rock. And so we were literally busting rock, breaking through rock to get to where we were going. We had 3 or 4 buckets and we kept filling them up and crawling out the tunnel. You couldn't stand up, so you were crawling on your hands and knees. My knees were bruised, very, very bruised and swollen from crawling in and out of there.
But the Wyatts' biggest obstacle wasn't the injuries the rock caused them, but the time it added to the dig. Unlike the earlier discoveries, this archaeological quest was taking too long. Ron ran out of money, and he and his sons had to return home to the US.
My dad would run out of money and come back home and work and save up, and then we would quit our job or our school and go right back. As soon as he had a ticket, I'm gone, you know.
Yeah, that was his life's mission, pretty much. He'd come back and work, make money, then go back.
We'd quit anything to go do that because it seemed real important.
When they returned to Jerusalem the next year, 1980, refunded and reinvigorated, they applied themselves to the obstacle between them and Jeremiah's grotto containing the Ark of the Covenant, the wall of solid rock.
Dad prayed usually in the morning, help us, you know, if we can find something.
We were constantly praying throughout this on a daily basis, you know, because we knew we were clueless.
Once more, Ron seemed to experience a guiding hand. He made a comment to his sons that he was impressed in some indefinable way to cut into the solid rock of the cliff face.
Every time we come to a stumbling block, we had to pray, and somehow we'd get around it and move on.
They set to work faithfully chipping at the solid rock of the cliff. Astonishingly, they broke through the rock into an open space. Could it be a cave? But the dig season for 1980 was ending, so Ron and his sons again had to go home to Tennessee and wait. Now, more than ever, Ron believed that when he returned, the Ark would be waiting. But could the Ark even have survived thousands of years buried in a cave? Even if he had discovered Jeremiah's grotto, Ron might find just a handful of dust.
In the case of the Ark of the Covenant, it's been 3,000 years since it was made. Now, we know, for example, that in Egypt, in a very dry environment, that wood can survive. We've got wooden objects from Egypt in many different tombs.
The Bible tells how God specified that the ark be made of acacia wood. Acacia is exceptionally hard and very dense. It will last a long time. In Egypt, acacia panels have been found over 3,000 years old. If Tutankhamun's ark-like chests survive, why not the Ark? In January 1982, after 3 years of digging, Ron still prayed that he would discover the Ark, excavating in the place God had led him to. But ill health dogged his sons, and he had to send them home.
We had got ill that one time. I had got the flu real bad. Danny got flu. And Danny stayed, I think, for another couple weeks after that, and then he came home.
Even without his sons to help him, Ron wouldn't give up.
He believed so strongly in what he was supposed to do that nothing would stop him.
No, he never gave up. He saw everything through. Even if he almost lost his life, he would regroup and go back again and try it again until he got to where he wanted to be. Yeah, he wasn't afraid.
But now, digging over 20 feet underground, even Ron realized that he couldn't work alone. He enlisted the help of a young local man. Together, they labored in the tunnels he and his sons had worked so hard to open up. One tunnel in particular was very difficult. A narrow passageway leading through a chimney, a tight vertical shaft so small that Ron had to exhale to squeeze through. Inside the tunnel, Ron saw a very small opening in the rock wall. Only Ron's assistant was small enough to wriggle inside. Something about this space seemed to fill him with dread. Gripped by sheer terror, he fled, never to return. Ron believed his assistant must have experienced the power of the Ark. Ron enlarged the opening and squeezed into the confined space. He found himself in a chamber filled with small rocks. He caught glimpses of gold, not the Ark, but ritual objects from the temple. Now he was certain the Ark must be in there somewhere. Crawling painfully over the rocks to the rear of the chamber, Ron saw a partially buried stone case. The lid was so near to the ceiling that he couldn't see inside. Could it contain the Ark? He had to find a way to see inside the stone case. See the Ark. But how? Now, Ron may not have been a professional archaeologist, but he was a professional nurse anesthetist, and now he put his medical knowledge to good use. He wondered whether a medical camera and probe, designed to see inside the human body, would allow him to investigate and identify the contents of the stone case. Alone again in the chamber, Ron pushed the camera into a small hole he drilled in the side of the stone case. And suddenly, there it was. Ron Wyatt was the first person to see the Ark of the Covenant lost for 2,500 years.
He was crying when he told me. He just said he couldn't believe it.
Ron Wyatt announced to the world that he had found the lost Ark of the Covenant, proof to non-believers of the existence of God. But if he thought he'd achieved his aim, Ron was in for a big surprise. The good news was not received with open arms. Professional archaeologists would need convincing evidence. They would want to see what Ron had seen, the Ark of the Covenant.
When it comes to any amateur enthusiast claiming that they found anything to do with the Bible, my first question to them is, show me the data. Show me your evidence.
Skeptics pointed to the fact that Ron Wyatt was alone when he found the Ark. He had no witness.
If you think you found the Ark of the Covenant, show me a picture.
But Ron didn't produce any pictures. He claimed he did have documents and photos, but was not allowed to show them. In a series of talks, he told people that the Israeli Antiquities Authority, the IAA, had made secrecy a condition of his excavating permit.
I'm not allowed to give the exact location, but I will say that the Ark of the Covenant is exactly where I found it. And we have proven that to the Antiquities Department in Israel. They have the proof, and they know it's been found.
But even the existence of a permit is disputed. Dr. Dan Bahat was the IAA district director at the time.
When I was a district archaeologist of Jerusalem, Ron Wyatt was in Jerusalem with his activities. To the best of my knowledge, he never received any permit to dig in Jerusalem.
Ron could have silenced his critics by simply showing them the Ark of the Covenant. Why not just return to the dig with witnesses? But Ron had bad news there too. He said the access tunnel he had made had been sealed by the authorities with reinforced concrete.
The way that you used to get through it through the garden tomb is closed. Can't get through that way anymore.
Ron Wyatt's claim to have discovered the Ark of the Covenant is backed up by no evidence whatsoever in terms of hard data.
Ron could never produce any evidence of the Ark of the Covenant for anyone. And yes, he did try. He did try.
Professional archaeologists openly expressed the opinion that Ron's discoveries were just too good to be true.
So while it takes years, decades, to become properly trained as an archaeologist, where you can read the ancient text, do the excavations, interpret the data and the analysis, it sounds like anybody can go out and try to find them. Now, the archaeologists know that that's like looking for a needle in a haystack, or rather a needle in many haystacks.
Ron was the first to admit he was an amateur. He believed God was responsible for his discoveries.
It's very obvious that I didn't find these on my own intelligence, or of my own intelligence. I don't think there's anybody on earth clever enough to have found all of these, but God knew where they were from day one, and he wanted everybody to see them.
So what was the truth? Lack of evidence begs the question, had Ron Wyatt made it all up?
As a person, he was a very pleasant person, but to this very day, I cannot make up my mind if he was a crook or a naive person. I say crook with reservation because I think maybe he was naive and he believed in what he said.
I had not known Ron to lie, and I knew he was telling the truth.
That was Dad's whole mission, show the truth. I mean, he didn't take archaeology or anything. That's why archaeologists don't think that he's legitimate, but God uses people, not necessarily professionals, to do his work.
Those who doubt Ron Wyatt point to one fact in particular. He found exactly what he set out to find, down to the last detail. Even after the ravages of 3,000 years, the Ark he described was exactly as depicted in a Bible picture book. He produced a drawing of just what it looked like, covered in gold and with a decorated gold rim and 2 gold cherubim on the lid.
It is interesting that what Ron Wyatt says he discovered is the typical or conventional description of the Ark. In actuality, if you find the Ark, it may look completely different.
There are, in fact, 2 quite different biblical descriptions of the Ark. Exodus has the Ark constructed by an artist, Bezalel. This is the famous Ark, Ron's Ark, covered all over with the purest gold, its lid with golden cherubim and a decorated rim of gold. But in another biblical account, not in Exodus, but the book of Deuteronomy, the Ark is far simpler. In Deuteronomy, Moses made the Ark himself. Just a simple acacia wood box with no decoration at all. This is a much more plausible container for a nomadic desert tribe to make and carry around with them in the wilderness.
This description of the Ark certainly lends itself to the belief that it's simply a storage box. And we find in archaeology, in King Tut's tomb and elsewhere, similar boxes.
According to professional archaeologists, Ron made a typical amateur's mistake. He went looking for one specific object to support a preconceived view that every Bible story is historically true. Trained archaeologists approach their subject with a more open mind, looking for any artifacts to help guide them to what the historical story might be, never sure what they might find.
You may be looking for one thing, asking one question, and all of a sudden something else pops up.
This is exactly what has just happened to one eminent archaeologist. Professor Yossi Garfinkel of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's very different from Ron Wyatt, but what he has found may change forever our understanding of the Ark. This is the ancient city of Kirbet Kiafa, above the valley of Elah. Famously, in this valley, about 3,000 years ago, the boy David slew the giant warrior Goliath with a stone from his slingshot. Professor Garfinkel has been digging here for 5 years, looking for neither David, nor Goliath, nor even the Ark of the Covenant.
I'm not trying to prove the Bible. You have the biblical tradition. This is a history which was written by people few thousand years ago. And what we can do as archaeologists is to see what we are finding.
Professor Garfinkel is looking for nothing and everything. As a result, his dig here in the summer of 2011 unearthed a fragmented clue to what the Ark may actually have been.
During the season, there were many fragments of quite interesting stone vessels, but as they were really broken to many pieces, we didn't realize what it was. So it was nicely packed, all these artifacts, and we sent them to the laboratory for conservation.
Highly skilled conservators explored what might be made of all the pieces. Rather like solving a fiendish 3D puzzle without the picture on the box as a guide. What they eventually rebuilt was extraordinary.
And when I came to see, I really didn't believe my eyes. It was a nice box made of stone, something that was never found before in any archaeological site in Israel or in the ancient Near East.
Professor Garfinkel knew little about the stone box at first, but during investigation, it began to tell its story. It seemed to be a model building of some kind.
This artifact is made from one block of stone, which was carved nicely in the shape of a building, and then it was painted red. There are traces of red pigment here. I think that there was a wooden door which was fixed here to the inside, and there were small pegs which fixed the door to its location.
But what exactly was this small model building used for?
Inside you can see a small depression, probably a base where a statue or maybe a symbol of God, a small stone or something was placed. So what is it? The way I understand it, an object like this, where they kept symbols of God inside it, and it was portable and moved from one place to another according to needs. And I understand it as a portable shrine.
Professor Garfinkel's thesis that this was a portable shrine is supported when the little building with doors is compared to the biblical account of the Temple of Solomon, where the Ark came to rest. They are eerily similar.
So this is what we call triple recessed doorway, or triple recessed door frame. And this is exactly how the Bible describes Solomon's palace and also the entrances in the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem.
But the box couldn't be a model of the temple. Radiocarbon dating tells us it is older than that. What is much more likely to be true is that the temple was a giant version of a portable shrine like this one. Then, Professor Garfinkel, with extraordinary insight, asked a vital question. What did people call this portable shrine when they used it in ancient times?
I think that probably the people in antiquity called such artifact Ark of God. And this is the biblical, the Hebrew name, Aron Elohim, Ark of God or cupboard of God.
So is this the truth about the Ark? That it was not a great and supernatural object? In the Hebrew Bible, the Ark of the Covenant is written Aron Habrit. Aron simply means chest or cupboard, a box to store things in.
In Hebrew, Aron is mean just a box where you can keep anything inside it. It's not necessarily something holy. Once you put inside a symbol of God, then the artifact became important. Not that the artifact by himself is not just a box. What is important is the meaning people gave to it.
In fact, Professor Garfinkel hasn't found just one ark, but two. The second is made of pottery and is different in form, but it is also a little building with pillars, roof beams, and a door. Garfinkel believes it is another portable shrine, another Ark of God.
So I was not looking for anything like the Ark or a thing like this, but once we have them, we need to deal and to interpret them. It's not just you find a nice thing, you put it in the museum and you go home. You also need to understand what you are doing.
Garfinkel's work reveals that there were many arks in many places, ritual shrines used by ordinary people as part of their worship. Does this mean the fabulous golden ark Ron was looking for may never have existed? Not necessarily.
When you have a large temple in Jerusalem, you have a large kingdom, you have a very nice ark, can be made with gold and silver and all kinds of other things. But in the small cities around it and in private houses, people will not have such big artifacts and made from such expensive materials.
So is it the case that the Ark of the Covenant, carried by the Israelites through the wilderness, could have been a simple object different from the one built for the temple in Jerusalem? No one knows for sure.
People can debate it. People can say I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong, but at least I can offer a new interpretation.
What Ron Wyatt would make of this debate, we'll never know. He died in 1999. Until the end of his life, he devoted himself to making many more controversial discoveries. to prove that the Bible is fact. He said he had a sample of Christ's blood from the crucifixion which proved Jesus had no earthly father. He claimed he had an encounter with angels in the chamber where he found his ark.
Tables of stone were found in the Ark of the Covenant. I personally removed them with the assistance of 4 angels who lifted the mercy seat, which I would estimate weighs about 900 pounds of solid gold.
Ron Wyatt was a master at organizing expeditions, getting the public interested, getting money for his expeditions, and creating a huge following. Whether he was a charlatan or a zealot or a madman is up to individual people's opinions.
To those who believe him, he was none of these. He was a man inspired to do his work by his faith.
When I get to heaven, I'm going to look around, and I want to see every one of you there.
I just feel really blessed to have had a dad like my father and to got to do this work. It's just been an amazing thing.
We may never know the truth about the Ark of the Covenant, but stories of its fabled power and symbolic importance ensure that each generation will dream of finding it.
The Ark exists today. It is somewhere. We know it.
The Ark has not yet been found in any location mentioned by the ancient sources. That doesn't mean it won't be found. If it is, it will be accidental. It will not be because somebody has gone out looking for it. They will have been looking or investigating or excavating something else entirely different. And lo and behold, there it will be.
Unearthed from the searing deserts of the Middle East, an ancient text told of hidden treasures. One man believed it was a list of gold and silver plundered from one of the great marvels of the ancient world, the Second Temple of Jerusalem.
It's really absolutely the kind of treasure list you would expect to find in a fiction book about a treasure.
If the text was true, it promised the greatest riches in history.
The treasure described in the copper scroll must have been temple treasure.
But the Copper Dead Sea Scroll has baffled experts and treasure hunters alike. Some said it was fake.
Is the treasure real, or is it a fabulous kind of fairy story?
The British scholar John Allegro was determined to get to the truth. It was a quest that would cost him nearly everything.
He was in the wilderness, literally in the wilderness.
But nothing would stop him in his search.
John Allegro was always up for an adventure.
That adventure would change his life forever. This is the story of John Allegro's quest to unravel the mysteries of the Copper Dead Sea Scroll. The story of the Copper Dead Sea Scroll began with a chance discovery on the shores of the Dead Sea in what was then Jordan in 1947. A young Bedouin shepherd, looking for his goat among the high cliffs, had come across a cave. In the dark void, he discovered tall earthenware jars containing rolls of parchment wrapped in cloth. These were the first of the fabled Dead Sea Scrolls, dating back almost to the time of Christ, the oldest biblical texts ever found. So precious, they were priceless.
The Dead Sea Scrolls are texts written in Hebrew, Aramaic, a few in Greek, from the time of Jesus. They contain copies of books of the Bible, which are 1,000 years earlier than any copy we had before. They fill in a gap in our knowledge, and they enable us to discover the roots of both Christianity and Judaism. They are fantastically important.
The Bedouin were quick to realize the value of their find, and a frenzy of scroll hunting began.
The number of items that came out of the caves was enormous, maybe 87,000 different fragments, representing about 940 different individual scrolls.
In Jerusalem, scholars were desperate to preserve the fragments, so they bought the scrolls from eager Bedouin, selling the precious manuscript parchment at high prices.
With the Dead Sea Scrolls, we've suddenly got an enormous quantity of Hebrew and Aramaic literature from the time of Jesus.
The Dead Sea Scroll fragments offered a tantalizing glimpse dating back some 2,000 years. But translating the ancient texts needed a crack team of scholars. In charge of the mission was a Catholic organization, the French École Biblique, run by its most senior priest, Father Roland Deveau. He put out an urgent call to the world's finest biblical scholars. At the University of Oxford, the request was put to a talented PhD student, John Allegro. He was no bookish academic. He was a man who had once faced the worst of human nature. Allegro had left school at 16 and joined the British Navy, where he served as an officer during the Second World War. After the conflict, he immersed himself in history, studying the original languages of the Bible, Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic.
He'd been one of the top students, both at undergraduate and at master's degree level in Manchester, and had gone to Oxford to study for his doctorate.
When the call came from Deveau, Allegro couldn't pass up the chance to study the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were true biblical mysteries he could unravel.
What fascinated him mainly was the sense that these tiny scraps of ancient material had last been handled by men scribbling down what they believed. It was the link, the personal link of nearly 2,000 years of the people who wrote them that brought the whole thing to life for him.
In 1953, he flew to Israel, a journey that would change his life. Allegro knew he and his colleagues were working on one of the most important discoveries of the millennium. But one scroll in particular caught Allegro's eye. Unlike all the others, it was not made of papyrus.
The copper scroll is made of very well-refined copper.
This strange copper scroll was discovered in 1952 in a cave located along a small area on the shores of the Dead Sea, known as Qumran. The cave's roof had collapsed, but amongst the rubble at the back, the copper scroll had been found in two pieces. It was inscribed on the inside with an ancient script. Everything about it was a puzzle.
Why was this text inscribed on copper in the first place? Copper, which is extremely refined. It's nearly 100% pure copper.
The technology of making it was not really known widely in that period. And there are serious questions as to how they could actually be able to do it.
Yet while the actual copper seemed advanced, the writing on the scroll was primitive.
It seems to be the case that the Hebrew letters are rather poorly formed. It's quite difficult to read.
However, the few words Allegro could make out stunned him.
He looked at the outside, read it from the outside and said, that's treasure list.
Allegro couldn't believe his eyes. It seemed he was looking at the answer to one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. In AD 70, the Romans sacked Jerusalem and ransacked the Second Temple. The temple was the holiest place in the Jewish faith. Built on the site of the fabled Temple of Solomon, it was filled with vast treasures accumulated over centuries.
Some of the treasure is gold and silver. Some of it is pottery and other artifacts, the possessions of the high priest.
The precious items that were in the temple at Jerusalem would have been of enormous value, huge amounts.
The Romans looted, plundered, and destroyed it. Some of what they stole can be seen to this day, depicted on the triumphal arch of Titus in Rome.
You can see a huge menorah, which is the seven-branched candlestick that would have been standing in front of the ark. There were trumpets, there were other chests of, obviously, things taken by the Romans back to Rome.
Folklore says the gold and silver was used to pay for the building of the Colosseum. But some believe that the Romans didn't steal all the treasure, that part of it was hidden away by the temple priests. Could Allegro be looking at a 2,000-year-old treasure map that might lead him to one of the greatest discoveries of all time? But frustratingly, he couldn't unravel the scroll. It seemed that 2,000 years of corrosion ensured its secrets would remain secure.
When it was discovered, the copper had become completely oxidized, that is, extremely brittle. So scholars recognized immediately that should they try to open it by unrolling it, it would simply disintegrate.
All sorts of solutions were proposed to open the copper scroll.
A number of really quite ridiculous suggestions were put forward. One, for instance, was that you could reduce the copper in hydrogen, but the whole thing would have just disintegrated and you'd have been left with nothing.
That turned out to be one of the more sensible ideas.
Another absurd attempt was the idea that you could use electrolysis to reduce the copper back from its oxidized state into its metallic state. Absolute metallurgically nonsense.
Numerous methods were considered, but all were rejected. There seemed to be no way of retrieving the scroll's tantalizing secrets. But Allegro refused to be beaten, and he believed he had the answer.
Allegro was the kind of character that wouldn't just say, yes, it'd be a nice idea if we could open it, wouldn't it? He very definitely would say, well, how are we going to open it? Let's do it.
He was now lecturing at Manchester University, which boasted one of the finest engineering departments in the world. The challenge would be a golden opportunity for them. But their response took him by surprise.
Allegro's head of department in Manchester was very determined that the reputation of the University of Manchester should not be put at risk by something going disastrously wrong with this scroll.
Refused by his own university, he turned to the nearby Manchester Institute of Technology. The head of department, Professor H. Wright Baker, embraced the opportunity and proposed a radical solution.
Professor H. Wright Baker was one of the top mechanical engineers, certainly in England and probably in the world. He came up with something that no one had actually applied before, as far as I know, to heavily corroded materials.
Baker's plan was to coat the scroll with strong epoxy resin to stop it disintegrating. Then he would cut through the top layer of the metal scroll, slicing it from one end to the other, cutting away a single section of scroll at a time.
He had a little circular blade which would cut just 1 millimeter, straight line.
After each cut, he'd rotate the scroll to cut and peel away another section.
The trick also, of course, was to try to cut in places where there wasn't any writing.
He began the job in the utmost secrecy. Baker was so nervous about making the first slice and destroying the precious scroll that he went ahead without even telling Allegro.
Wright Baker wouldn't let anybody except himself witness the first cut, just in case something terrible went wrong.
He would, I think, have been absolutely scared that he was going to be the one responsible for destroying the copper scroll.
On October the 1st, 1955, he made the first cut. It took just 10 minutes. In the following days, Baker made the remaining slices.
In the cutting open of the scroll, only one letter of Hebrew was actually lost. This is quite remarkable. Wright Baker did as fine a job as anybody in the world could have done.
And so Allegro became the first man to see the scroll's ancient text, revealed for the first time in almost 2 millennia.
To see the inside of this scroll revealed to the air the first time for nearly 2,000 years was exciting, astonishing.
He immediately set to work, decoding it.
Deciphering the copper scroll was extremely difficult. There were terms that people had never seen before.
And soon, he found a further mystery. The script had been written by several different people.
It seemed that the scribe, or in fact scribes, because I think they found at least 3, if not 4, different hands been at it, could possibly not have really understood what they were copying.
Allegro reasoned that using several scribes, each writing just a small section, would be the best way to keep the treasure secret, as none of them could learn the full story of where it was hidden.
It seemed they were probably copying off some parchment scroll, some writing, but had just been told to put it down, engrave it on this sheet of metal without knowing what it was about.
As he translated the copper scroll, Allegro began to realize that it identified several different locations in Judea. Why? What was their significance?
He thought he recognized from the topography of the Qumran area references within the copper scroll to places like the Great Wadi and a fissure in the rock which had been caused by an earthquake which was well attested in, I think, 31 BC. Flights of steps, tunnels. It all seemed to make sense from what he knew of the archaeological sites around Qumran.
But critically, the more Allegro studied the scroll, the more certain he became that there was only one place the riches it described could have come from.
The treasure described in the copper scroll must have been temple treasure. He couldn't think where else would have had such a wealth of gold coins, tithe vessels, and gold bars, silver bars, precious metals, precious stones.
Because the treasure was so precious, Allegro believed that whoever had hidden it had created an inventory which had been scribed onto extremely pure copper, soft enough to roll.
It was not normal to be engraving on copper at that period in history, Second Temple period. There wasn't copper of that purity available to actually do the engraving, and the fabrication techniques they were using were quite unique. It's a one-off.
Unlike papyrus or parchment, the scroll was made to last, possibly for hundreds of years, awaiting a time when it was safe to recover the treasure. Allegro now put two and two together. If the stories were true that the temple priests had managed to hide some of the treasure, then the locations he had translated had to be a list of the places it had been hidden. For safekeeping, it must have been spread out.
Once he'd initially translated the first few parts of it, became a real obsession for John.
He realized this was telling you exactly where the treasure was, and if you could find the place, you should be able to find the treasure.
The scroll's text was written in columns. Each listed a series of locations with the precise quantities and weights of the treasure to be found within. In the first column, Allegro read 40 cubits under the steps, entering to the east, a money chest and its contents of a weight of 17 talents. And then, in the tomb of the queen, buried at 12 cubits, 9 talents.
It's really absolutely the kind of treasure list that you would expect to find in a fiction book about a treasure. Buried, you go, dig, 5 paces to the left, down you go, 5 meters, and boom, boom, there it is. So it really is absolutely the perfect treasure list.
Allegro sent his translation to Father Roland de Vaux, the man in charge of the Dead Sea Scrolls project.
He waited for the telegram coming back saying, "This is absolutely great, fantastic, you've done a wonderful job. We're having a press conference tomorrow. We'll tell them all about this treasure. How exciting."
But the answer was not at all what he expected.
The reaction from Roland de Vaux was, don't tell anyone. If it's treasure, we don't want anyone to know about it. Keep it completely under your hat.
The fact was that de Vaux simply didn't believe the treasures described by the copper scroll were real. Nor did his most trusted expert, Father Joseph Milik.
De Vaux certainly was skeptical about the reality of the treasure, and he'd appointed Joseph Milik to be the official editor of the Copper Scroll.
Milik, his first reaction was that the scroll was a work of fiction and of imagination and was not to be taken seriously.
Unlike Allegro, Milik and de Vaux felt that the sheer amounts of gold described in the scroll couldn't possibly be genuine.
It was the gold and the silver that was most astonishing because of the apparent quantities it was in.
The units of weight that they were using was a talent, which is about 35 kilograms, 72 pounds, which is a huge weight. They were coming up with totals of 65 tons of silver and 25 tons of gold.
If the scroll weights were correct, It listed a quarter of all the known gold in the world at the time and all of the known silver. It made no sense, though Allegro thought he had an answer.
Allegro was obviously stumped by the huge weights, and he did actually suggest that the talent, that the weight unit they were using might well be 1/60th of the biblical talent, and that would have given much more reasonable amounts of treasure.
Devoe and Milik had another problem. All the other Dead Sea Scrolls were written on parchment. Why was this the only one engraved in copper? However, Allegro argued that this just added to the scroll's credibility.
John Allegro was convinced that the treasure was real because the scroll was made of copper. It wasn't parchment or papyrus. Who would be writing such a fairy tale on copper?
But was it just that? A 2,000-year-old fairy tale? Devoe and Milik's doubts threw the whole credibility of both the scroll and Allegro into question.
This was his baby. He'd gone to all the trouble to get it open, and now he was not only being denied any of the spoils of his triumph, he was kind of being pushed aside, put out of the picture. He obviously resented it. Must have done.
Despite their reservations, the École Biblique did agree to unravel the full text of the scroll. So in 1956, the second, larger section was sent to H. Wright Baker's laboratory. Once opened, Allegro translated the text and sent it to Jerusalem as before. This time, Devoe didn't even believe he deserved a rejection letter. Allegro heard nothing from him at all.
Suddenly, he found he was getting a very chilly reception indeed. He gathered that everything had changed. In fact, everything had been poisoned for him in Jerusalem.
Convinced it was a fake, Devoe refused to let Allegro publish anything about the Copper Scroll.
He was regarded as somebody who couldn't be trusted to keep quiet, that wanted to go out and tell everybody what he was finding in the scrolls.
Allegro protested, demanding to be heard. The reaction from Devoe was swift and decisive. Allegro was ostracized.
Wright Baker had been told he wasn't to be trusted, therefore he wasn't even allowed in the lab or in the lectures. He was threatened with not having his contract renewed, which would mean losing his job.
Relations were then extremely strained. They virtually condemned his career to the wilderness. His career went downhill, his health went downhill, and psychologically he was really, really damaged. It's almost as if they were saying your work has been useless.
Allegro returned to his base at Manchester University. There he waited patiently for years to be allowed to publish his own account of the Copper Dead Sea Scroll. Then in 1959, out of the blue, Devoe's lead scholar, Father Joseph Milik, published his official translation of the scroll.
They said it was a collection of fabulous treasure, so fabulous that it could only be fictional. End of story. And he knew perfectly well that wasn't so. He couldn't believe that they really, really believed that.
He was very upset, particularly because he didn't agree with a lot of the wording of Milik's translation.
It was now a matter of public record. The scroll to which he had dedicated so much of his professional life was a fake. Allegro was outraged.
Allegro had played the game up to that time. He hadn't published anything before Milik had had a chance to put his ideas first.
He was bursting to tell everybody about this. He'd gone to so much trouble to get it deciphered. He had been very patient. He had waited. I think he had any amount of frustration just built up. And he couldn't wait any longer, so he published.
So against Devoe's orders, he wrote his own account. News of the treasure was an instant hit.
The book sold very well and very widely. It stirred the public imagination with the Dead Sea Scrolls once again.
And Allegro didn't just publish a book. He was going to mount an expedition. He would go out into the desert to prove the scroll was real and find the treasure himself.
He was sure of his readings of the scroll, that it was real and factual and not fiction.
All he needed was backers.
He could not rely on his colleagues in Jerusalem. He could not rely on the Jordanian Department of Antiquities. He could not rely on the University of Manchester. It was down to him.
So Allegro cranked up his publicity machine, seeking backers from the press and public. The Daily Mail newspaper stepped up and part-sponsored his expedition. It even sent its star correspondent, Ralph Izzard, to cover the story. With millions of readers now following his every move, the pressure began to mount. Allegro now had to find the fabled treasure.
I'm sure that Allegro had mixed feelings about the presence of the Daily Mail. On the one hand, he must have loved the idea that there was going to be this kind of coverage. On the other hand, I think he should have felt under pressure to find something really exciting because it was in the glare of publicity.
The pressure was all the greater because he now had much of the Jordanian army at his disposal, courtesy of his second sponsor, King Hussein of Jordan.
King Hussein recognized the huge significance of the Dead Sea Scroll material.
The king personally supported Allegro's quest and mobilized his forces on the ground.
King Hussein gave help with making the Royal Jordanian Army landing craft and overland vehicles, and also helicopter support available, which was extremely useful in ferrying supplies out to the camps.
Allegro recruited a band of skilled but amateur enthusiasts. Archaeologists, architects, surveyors, technicians, and a cameraman to photograph the terrain described by the copper scroll. With the world watching, they set off to make camp in the Jordanian desert. Allegro's first destination, the ancient ruin of Khirbet Mird in the Vale of Achor, known 2,000 years ago as Hyrcania. It was a fortress that Allegro believed was once the palace of King Herod of Judea when the scroll was made. Allegro's translation told him that 40 cubits, about 18 meters, under some steps, entering to the east, lay a money chest, its contents weighing 17 talents, nearly 2 kilos. And incredibly, they found something. In the rock face, the team discovered a shaft, a flight of stone stairs that led to an underground, vaulted room. The location, as described in the copper scroll, existed. It was real. But vandals had wrecked the site. Marble columns and mosaic tiles had been hacked to pieces. And any treasure that had been hidden there had vanished. And then it got even worse. When Allegro and his team went back to camp to lick their wounds, their disappointment was quickly swept away by terror. A powerful storm hit Allegro's camp. It flattened their tents, wrecked their stores, and they lost all their precious water. There was a real chance they could die in the desert. But luckily, Allegro's friend, King Hussein, had been keeping a close eye on the expedition.
In the morning when the storm had died down, they found the Royal Jordanian Army trucks on their way, bringing fresh water supplies, fresh equipment, and helping to get them established again and peg them down a bit more firmly on the rock for the next time.
Disaster averted, Allegro's next stop was Khirbet Qumran, an ancient settlement about a mile inland from the northeast shore of the Dead Sea.
The Copper Scroll does mention as one of the hiding places of treasure a place called Sakaka. And Sakaka is quite possibly the name of Qumran itself. And many of the places mentioned in the Copper Scroll do seem to point to the Qumran area.
Khirbet Qumran had been home to the Essene Jewish sect, who'd written and hidden the Dead Sea Scrolls in the local caves. If the scrolls had survived untouched for 2 millennia, perhaps the treasure was untouched too. In fact, coins had been found in the area only a few years before.
A hoard of silver shekels had been discovered, and this had led some people to think that maybe the Copper Scroll described the rest of the Essene treasure.
3 juglets of silver coins which seem to be referred to within the Copper Scroll. And if the Romans or the Bedouin or anybody else who looted the place had happened to miss these 3 juglets of silver coins, who knows what else they might have missed.
Allegro's team swept the site with metal detectors. The occasional ping of the machines raised their hopes. But in fact, the sensors were being triggered by the natural magnetism of the rocks. By now, press from around the world were following Allegro's treasure hunt. They needed a story.
They had expected to have to fight his way through a throng of journalists every time he stepped outside. They were after pictures of him finding treasure.
Allegro then searched a concealed cave, high in the cliff face. He found bones and pottery dating from 400 BC. But no treasure. The press would have to wait. Allegro had found the locations mentioned in the Copper Scroll, but its treasures still eluded him. Undaunted, he pushed on to Jerusalem. First he dug in what he believed was the tomb of Zadok, the priest of Solomon's first temple. He followed the clues in the scroll, and sure enough, he found a tomb. But again, no treasure. But he had one final plan. A few miles away lay the Temple Mount. This is a sacred place to three major religions. To Jews, it is the site of the now destroyed temple. To Muslims, it is from where the prophet was taken to heaven. And to Christians, it is the place where Christ was buried, the Holy Sepulchre. Because of its extraordinary religious sensitivity, no one is allowed to dig there. But Allegro was determined to try. Allegro had heard that beneath the dome of the rock, there was a labyrinth of passages and chambers. The scroll mentioned 24 sites within the temple area. Maybe the temple treasure had been hidden underneath where it had once stood. Allegro tried to get permission from the Jordanian Antiquities Office and seemed to be getting somewhere.
He filled in forms for here, forms for there, forms for the next person. He waited and waited.
But at the last minute, the authorities refused.
He could not get permission to go where he really wanted to go, which was to the chambers that were known to exist, a whole system of cisterns and chambers and tunnels underneath the dome of the rock.
Despite his friendship with King Hussein, the army denied him access.
The authorities were very reluctant to let anybody interfere with what the Temple Mount, let alone an individual enthusiast like Allegro. Allegro never really had a chance at the Dome of the Rock.
Privately, Allegro suspected the hand of his old nemesis, Roland de Vaux.
He didn't have hard and fast evidence. It was just a suspicion due to the fact that they published some article which sounded as if it was rather rejoicing in the fact that the Allegro expedition hadn't been allowed to go very far, which made him think that they'd had something to do with stopping him.
Allegro was more frustrated than ever.
In Khirbet Mird, Allegro found nothing, and in Jerusalem he also found nothing. That is, of course, he found nothing where he was actually allowed to look.
But for all his despair, Allegro's expeditions had not been a total failure.
They found very little in the way of actual treasure. They found possibilities. They're enough to confirm John's readings of the Copper Scroll, the places where there were likely to have been deposits laid.
Allegro may not have found any treasure, but he had found the sites listed in the Copper Scroll. That at least suggested that he was onto something. Not long after, Allegro received news of a breakthrough. A Bedouin friend had found secret caves that might hold the precious temple treasure. Back in Manchester, he went into fundraising mode once more. A year later, he'd raised enough money to return to the desert. His new destination was a place dubbed Christmas Cave, an area that was relatively unexplored.
There had not really been an adequate survey of all the caves in the region, so he thought that he needed to begin somewhere. And Christmas Cave, which is the other side of the Wadi from Qumran, seemed like an excellent place to start.
Allegro now set up camp on the southernmost shores of the Dead Sea. And this time he'd brought a huge and diverse group of adventure seekers.
The hard work would be done by local Arabs, but he also was open-minded enough to take with him some student teachers. He used their enthusiasm to match his own as he set out on his quest.
Joining the archaeologists and surveyors were a dozen female students.
It still was pretty unusual for young women to join expeditions to places where there were absolutely no facilities of any sort, living in tents, no running water, no water at all except what was found in the pools and the wadis, absolutely no toilet facilities. But it was a big adventure and they coped extremely well.
Allegro focused on 3 locations: Christmas Cave, a complex in a high cliff accessible only by helicopter; a stone ruin at Mazin, the location of a 1st century BC military base possibly used by Jewish rebels resisting the Romans; and Ein Feshka, with its nearby honeycomb-like warren of caves. Once again, King Hussein lent his support, forcing his government to fast-track excavation licenses, whilst airlifting the equipment into camp. Soon Allegro and his trusted team could set off for Christmas Cave.
They wormed their way inside, and it was very dark and full of bats, and they didn't think it was going anywhere, but the tunnel went on and on.
The cave had already produced Roman period oil lamps and jugs of silver coins from Byzantine times. Surely there could be more. But weeks of search proved fruitless. The explorations to Mazin and to the caves near Ein Feshka also turned up nothing. Then on Christmas Day, the pressure on Allegro reached a new level. King Hussein visited the camp.
The king took a personal interest in what was going on in this particular expedition and came on Christmas Day to visit the expedition.
Did John Allegro feel under pressure when the king arrived in the helicopter and greeted them all on Christmas Day? I think he should have felt under pressure, and a normal person would have done.
But all Allegro could point to was a few Roman coins and artifacts, dating back to around 70 AD, the time the Romans plundered the Second Temple.
I think as a treasure hunt, it was unsuccessful. As an adventure, it was an extraordinary story.
But for Allegro, adventure was not enough. He had given a decade of his life to unraveling the mysteries of the Copper Scroll. He'd been vilified, his career almost ruined, and he'd taken great risks to search for the hiding place of the ancient treasure. But finally, reluctantly, Allegro called time on his last expedition. He had failed to find any treasure listed in the Copper Scroll. John Marco Allegro died in 1988. He went to the grave almost alone in the belief that the Copper Dead Sea Scroll was authentic. But today, most scholars believe it really is a treasure map, giving directions to real treasures.
His translation work is admirable. He was right. He was right about the fact that the Copper Scroll is a genuine document, and virtually every scholar today accepts that.
John Allegro has been vindicated.
But if it is genuine, where is the treasure?
I suspect that the Romans, who would have known that the temple treasures would have contained some gold and silver, possibly they tortured those they captured and secured some of the items.
And they're not the only ones who might have looted the temple's riches.
It doesn't seem to me unlikely that after 2,000 years of Bedouin roaming around, that treasure might have been found, but we didn't know about it.
And that sadly is the probable truth. In the intervening 2,000 years, it's very likely everyone's taken their share.
The questions remain, no answers, just more questions.
But there is one other possibility. A small section of the copper scroll tells of another scroll, hidden in a tunnel in northern Kolit, containing further secrets of buried temple treasure. But the location of Kolit remains a mystery, and that means that at least some of the treasure could still be out there. From the Knights of the Round Table to the Nazis, the Holy Grail is the world's most sought-after Christian relic.
It symbolizes redemption, it symbolizes salvation, it symbolizes eternal life.
This was the cup said to have been used by Jesus at the Last Supper.
Objects that had come in contact with the body of Christ were particularly important.
Credited with supernatural powers, it has been sought by knights and treasure hunters for centuries.
It's this incredible holy object that you search for on a great quest.
But were they all looking in the wrong places? Because one person thinks she has found it. Janice Bennett believes an agate cup in the Cathedral of Valencia is the Holy Grail. What's more, it has been on display there for more than 500 years.
It's an important relic, it's an important symbol of Christianity, and it deserves attention and veneration.
This is the story of her quest to uncover the truth.
It really had all the makings of being one of the greatest stories in the history of humanity.
If she is right, this is an amazing tale of courage and survival that could finally lay to rest the mystery of the Holy Grail. In 1991, whilst on holiday in Spain, American writer and historian Janice Bennett visited the ancient city of Valencia. After walking around the old quarter, she decided to visit the magnificent cathedral. It was here, quite by accident, that she stumbled on something bizarre and intriguing.
I happened to notice a small chapel in the cathedral as I was leaving.
Entering the chapel, she saw an illuminated shrine behind the high altar containing a small chalice. Richly studded with pearls, rubies, and emeralds. This is Valencia Cathedral's most prized possession, the Santo Chalice, also known in English as the Holy Grail.
The Holy Grail was a drinking vessel which was venerated. And the legends say why it was venerated. It was venerated as the cup of Christ from the Last Supper.
According to Christian belief, the Last Supper was the final meal Jesus shared with his apostles in Jerusalem before he was betrayed and crucified.
He took the bread and he said, "This is my body," and he broke the bread and shared it with his disciples. And then he took the cup and he said, "This is my blood, the blood of the new and everlasting covenant." And once again, the disciples drank from the cup. And then he said, crucially, "Do this in memory of me." So this was not just a one-off meal, it was something that he wanted his followers to repeat.
One of the core beliefs of Christianity, the sacrament of the Eucharist, or Holy Communion, derives from the words spoken by Jesus at that meal. The act has become central to all Christian worship.
The Eucharist is the source and summit of the Christian life. It's really at the heart of everything we do, everything we believe. We believe that Christ is present under the appearance of bread and wine. And when we receive the bread and wine at communion, we are receiving Jesus. We are one with him.
But on that day in Valencia, to Janice it seemed almost absurd. Surely she couldn't be standing just a few meters away from the Holy Grail.
I really didn't feel anything when I looked at it. It didn't speak to me in any way. And I wasn't captivated by it. I wasn't particularly impressed.
Janice noticed that none of the other visitors seemed particularly awestruck either.
As I recall, there were only one or two other people in the chapel. They seemed to be either disinterested or, at the very least, unaware of what they were actually seeing.
But even so, Janice's interest was piqued to find out more.
I looked in the gift shop in the cathedral. The only thing I could find was a small brochure that had been rather poorly translated from Spanish into English.
It didn't say much, but reading the booklet, Janice began to discover a little more about the chalice's history. She was hardly the first to be drawn into the mystery of the Holy Grail.
The interest in chalices emerges from a desire to come in contact with something that had actually come in contact with the body of Christ.
For centuries, Grail hunters from all over the world have been searching for this miraculous object.
It symbolizes redemption, it symbolizes salvation, it symbolizes eternal life. And in a way, the Holy Grail stands for man's quest for God, man's quest for truth.
The Holy Grail in the Middle Ages became the motif of a lot of legends and romances and poetry, became the symbol of the aspiration of any Christian knight to go on a quest for the Holy Grail.
It's this incredible holy object that you search for on a great quest. It represents chastity and purity.
Along the way, it has become shrouded in myths and mystical powers.
It heals wounds, it offers salvation.
So much so that even at the height of the Nazi regime, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, searched for the Grail, believing its powers would help win him the war. He converted a great castle into a modern-day Camelot, with a ritual chamber and its own round table. He planned to display the Grail here, but he too failed in his quest.
It's become the one object in the world that is almost impossible to attain. It's become a symbol of something far beyond human aspirations, the absolute pinnacle of what we desire.
So over the centuries, the Grail has received many associations. Everything from St. Joseph of Arimathea and Glastonbury, King Arthur and his knights, the Templars, and more recently, Dan Brown, Indiana Jones, Monty Python. But essentially, beneath all these stories and myths is this idea of a cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper the night before he was crucified.
So could this object in Valencia be the true cup of Christ? That same one everyone has been searching for? Janice's research showed whether this was or wasn't the real Grail, people had been prepared to die for it.
I found a very small booklet that had been written by Olmos Canalda. Now, he was a Spanish priest who was actually responsible for saving this chalice from destruction during the Spanish Civil War.
In the 1930s, Spain was a deeply divided country, politically torn between right-wing nationalist and left-wing Republican parties. As the Great Depression hit, the country fell into turmoil. After the king abdicated, the Republicans were elected to power and the army rebelled. Spain was in a state of civil war. And like all civil wars, atrocities were committed by both sides.
It was a time of great violence and strife, and it's often forgotten that the church itself had a very difficult time. It was persecuted. 13 Spanish bishops were put to death at the hands of the communists.
Many churches were desecrated, plundered, things stolen, reliquaries stolen, priests and nuns and religious killed by the communists who had a hate against the church, which was a symbol for the ancient regime.
In this climate, there was no respect for relics. Valencia and the chalice were in danger. At 9 a.m. on the 21st of July 1936, 4 people celebrated Mass with the Holy Chalice for the last time.
As they said Mass, hordes of soldiers began to surround the cathedral. They were very concerned. One priest locked and bolted the doors. At 10 o'clock, they felt the situation was so serious that they came up with a very dangerous plan. There just happened to be one woman in attendance at this Mass named Maria Sabina Sway. So they asked her to carry out this rather dangerous mission. They enveloped the chalice in silk, wrapped it in a newspaper, and planned to smuggle it out.
Sneaking through the church crypt, she carried her precious parcel beneath her coat. She had to walk through groups of armed soldiers. At any moment, they could discover her hidden treasure. But luck was on her side. Her brave action was just in time.
They entered the chapel of the Holy Grail. They burned all the pews and confessionals. They even burned the tabernacle where it had been kept. The fire was so intense that many paintings and precious works of art were destroyed.
But despite the destruction, the chalice had escaped. When the war finally ended, on March the 30th, 1939, it was brought out of its hiding place in the countryside and returned to the authorities in Valencia, where the chalice has remained in the cathedral ever since.
That story really impressed me, so much so that I felt that even if this weren't the real Holy Grail, I didn't feel it would be a waste of time to investigate it because it was so deserving of having its story told by its own merits.
But the key question for Janice was, if this was the real Grail, how had it got from the Holy Land in the 1st century to 21st century Spain?
Well, of course, it was very important for me to trace the story of this chalice from the beginning. You know, how did it get from Jerusalem to Spain?
Janice needed to work out how the cup might have left Jerusalem in the first place.
Establishing the authenticity of any object that supposedly goes back to Jesus, whether it be the chalice, the cross, the nails, is incredibly difficult, and it requires an awful lot of detective work.
So Janice focused on the events following the Last Supper. Going back to the earliest traditions of the Church, she discovered St. Peter was said to have gone from Jerusalem to Rome, where he became the first pope.
Well, we believe that St. Peter was made the head of the church by Jesus himself. He's given the name Peter, which means rock. He is the rock on which the church is built.
Janice felt it likely that because of his importance in early Christianity, St. Peter would have been given the cup and taken it to Rome.
Certainly, something as precious as the cup used by Jesus at that Last Supper surely would have been saved in some way, surely would have been passed down, and St. Peter is the likely sort of person who might end up with it.
She believed he would have then used this cup to celebrate the first Eucharist.
Christians felt that relics were extremely important because they were really a link between past and present. They represented something that was sacred, something beyond human comprehension.
But the fact that it could have been given to St. Peter was hardly proof. She needed to find more evidence. She looked into the earliest traditions of the Eucharist and discovered that when the Mass was codified, it had a very particular form of words.
In the Roman Catholic Mass, you have two different versions of the consecration. You have the general canon and the Roman canon. And the Roman canon says, not Christ took the cup in his hands, but it says, hunc preclarem calicem, what means this very chalice.
By saying this very chalice, did it mean that when the popes celebrated Mass then, they were using the actual Holy Grail from the Last Supper? Janice believed what is just tradition now was based on actual facts back then.
The Roman canon of the Mass are the words that Jesus spoke at the Last Supper. It originated in Rome with St. Peter and his followers, his successors. So many scholars would believe that this was the actual cup that had been used by Christ and that the popes were very well aware of that fact.
But 200 years after St. Peter may have brought the cup to Rome, disaster struck. Janus discovered that in 257, the Emperor Valerian instigated a systematic persecution of Christians. The bishops of Rome and Carthage were both beheaded, and the Bishop of Toulouse was tied to the tail of a bull and had his brains bashed out.
The Valerian persecution, I think there was more of an effort to just, well, literally, in every sense, decapitate the church. So take the leaders, just kill them by decapitation. Straightforward execution, you know. This is what will happen to you if you carry on in your insane, eccentric religious beliefs.
The Pope at the time was Sixtus II. Knowing he will be executed, the one thing he can do is preserve the cup. Janus read how he summoned a deacon of the church, a Spaniard called Lawrence, and asked him to safeguard the treasure. But the question was, had the Grail been part of those treasures?
So just on a whim, I started flipping through the files, hoping maybe I could find something about the life of St. Lawrence that might mention the fact that he had actually sent this cup of the Last Supper to Spain.
Janus then continued her research and came across an amazing discovery. A copy of a 17th century manuscript containing material she'd never seen before on the life of St. Lawrence.
This I felt was so significant that I ordered copies of the entire manuscript, had them sent to my home in the United States, and began to translate them.
Janus Bennett had discovered the manuscript of Abbot Donato. It told how Pope Sixtus had given the Grail to Lawrence, who, after defying the might of Rome, was put to death in the most horrific manner.
He was placed on a gridiron, having been stripped naked, and he was slowly roasted to death. But such was St. Lawrence's faith and courage that he was able to make light of the situation and even jest as he was being roasted on that gridiron. And he even said at one stage, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side."
But critically, Janus learned from the manuscript that before Lawrence died, he too had passed the chalice on to a fellow Spaniard.
Donato is very explicit. He says, and he gave to Priscillius, a co-disciple from the homeland of Spain, the cup in which Christ consecrated his blood on the night of the Last Supper. So here we have this direct, very explicit reference that also provides the name of the Spaniard to whom Lawrence entrusted such an important relic.
So the chalice had escaped with Priscillius, and Janus was building a strong case for Lawrence, getting the Grail to Spain.
According to tradition, he managed to get a Spanish soldier, a legionnaire from Spain, to carry this relic to Huesca, where the parents of St. Lawrence had an estate. So it was kept by the parents, and it was safe there.
So could the chalice have been taken to Huesca, a town in northeastern Spain? Janus traveled there and discovered at first hand how strong the cult of St. Lawrence remains there today. Further evidence linking the Grail to Spain.
In Huesca, it is so evident the importance that St. Lawrence has had for the people for so many years, that this tradition is so deeply enrooted in their culture that the entire town seems to be dedicated to him. I mean, you see these martyrdom motifs everywhere. 3 churches dedicated to St. Lawrence. Really, it's amazing.
But if the chalice had been taken to Huesca, it was there that the trail went cold. And what's more, this coincided with the greatest period of turmoil and religious conflict in Spanish history, the Muslim invasion.
I think it was safe then in Huesca, but the problem was that the Muslims came up from Africa and invaded Spain in the year 711. So at that time, Christians were really forming caravans all over Spain, going to the mountains in the northern parts to hide all the relics because they knew that they weren't safe.
For the next 250 years, there was no mention of the Holy Grail. But then, the records say that in 1037, it reappeared in a secluded monastery high in the Pyrenees.
I think the first time I went to San Juan de la Peña, I was immediately struck by this location. An absolutely magnificent monastery, very simple, but in such an incredible setting in the Pyrenees that it really invokes awe.
San Juan de la Peña was an important strategic location, a burial place of Spanish kings and a safe haven for relics.
A good part of northern Spain stayed Christian throughout this entire process, and that remained a stronghold and the point of resistance against Muslim occupation.
We know the chalice was here in 1037 because of a remarkable historic event.
It was the place where the first Mass in Latin language was celebrated in 1037 at a council where the Roman Mass was introduced into Mozarabic Spain. So when the papal delegate introduced and celebrated for the first time the Roman Mass, he consecrated with this important relic.
After the cardinal had used the Holy Cup of the Last Supper in the celebration of the Mass, San Juan de la Peña became a center for pilgrimage.
So there were thousands of people every year passing by. They liked to tell their stories of the relics along the way. And so the knowledge of this relic became very well known throughout Europe.
However it had got there, from this point on, the cup was hugely venerated on this site as the Holy Grail. Janice believed she had found a firm trail of evidence, taking the chalice from Jerusalem to Rome and now to the north of Spain. She now needed to discover how it got to Valencia. Janice read that after centuries safely stored in the remote monastery of San Juan de la Peña, the Grail was on the move once again. Reading the monastery's records, she discovered how, on September the 26th, 1399, the cup she had seen in the Cathedral of Valencia was handed over by the monks as a gift to the king.
It sets forth all the details of this transfer, of how he took it to his palace, the Aljaferia in Saragossa. And he mentions the fact that this is the cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper and that it was sent to Spain by St. Lawrence.
From then on, she found out that successive monarchs kept the Grail with them, and it moved about their royal courts from Zaragoza to Barcelona, and then finally, Valencia.
And you see it is moving more and more south because during the centuries, the front between the Christianites and the Muslims moved more and more to the south until in 1492, Spain was completely Christian again.
By 1428, the chalice was in the Cathedral of Valencia, where it has remained ever since. For Janice, it was all coming together. Finally, she believed she had tracked the complete journey of the chalice from Jerusalem to Valencia. But it was now that the difficult questions began. It could conceivably have been a cup that had come from Rome, but that didn't mean it was the cup of Christ used at the Last Supper. Proving that would be much more difficult.
I did most of the work at home, of course. I would have copies of everything made in the National Library or wherever I found them, or when possible, I bought the books themselves and brought them home with me so that I could do it in my own home and piece everything together that way. I took many photographs along the way so that I would have that record as well.
Amongst the problems she faced were the many rival grails.
Well, we believe that by the 16th century, there were at least 20 chalices or other objects that claimed to be the Holy Grail.
There are three well-known grails today. The Genoa chalice, now proven to be a glass dish of Islamic origin.
Then we have the Unearthed Chalice, which is a beautiful silver work with a lot of decoration and human figures around. But the human figures alone prove that it must be Byzantine, because in Judaism, human figures were forbidden.
And if the Antioch chalice was too recent, then the wooden Nantius cup, with no provenance before the 19th century, was no contender either. One by one, Janice ruled out the pretenders. But how could she prove that the cup in Valencia was the real one? The solution had to be in proper archaeological testing.
For one thing, the object needs at least to be intrinsically plausible. So it needs to be something that does come from the 1st century, or at least plausibly comes from the 1st century, is something that somebody like Jesus, a Jewish peasant from Galilee, might have had, or his sponsors or friends might have had.
Janice discovered that the only detailed independent scientific analysis done on the chalice was by Dr. Antonio Beltran in the 1960s.
Professor Beltran was the professor at the University of Zaragoza, a leading Spanish archaeologist who, in the 1960s, was commissioned by the Archbishop of Valencia to study the relic of the Santo Chalice from an archaeological point of view and to date it.
A prolific academic author and one of Spain's leading archaeologists, Beltran was also an expert on artwork of the ancient world.
Dr. Beltran felt that he didn't have to worry about whether or not it was authentic, that he could just proceed without concern about what the church would think if he saw that this wasn't possible to have been on the table of the Last Supper.
Dr. Beltran's findings were startling. He stated that the chalice was made up of 3 distinct parts: the base, the stem, and the upper cup, and they were all from different periods. The goldwork linking the base to the upper cup was the most recent.
At a certain point, probably in the 14th century, those 2 stone elements are put together. The gold work seems very much in keeping with what gold work is in Spain in the 14th century.
If you see the golden frame, this is clearly medieval work. There's no question about it.
Dr. Beltran said the base was made of chalcedony stone. He concluded it was probably an inverted incense burner, chosen as a base to support the cup because of its similarity in color and material. But its design and poor quality of craftsmanship indicated it was possibly from as late as the 9th century, and so couldn't have anything to do with the true Grail. Beltran then focused all his attention on the upper cup. It too was made from chalcedony, but exquisitely crafted and of a very high quality, similar to those made at a very specific period of time.
And he dated it into the Hellenistic period, 3rd to 1st century before Christ. And you can prove it very easily that this dating is correct by just comparing it with other archaeological discoveries from this period.
And there was more than it just dating from the right period. According to Beltran, the upper cup was a great example of a luxury stone item from the skilled workshops of the Eastern Mediterranean, the very area Jesus Christ came from.
He said that these stone cups were fabricated in workshops in Egypt, Syria, and the Mediterranean, that they were actually very common in Greek and Roman times, and that they were used on luxurious tables. They were almost entirely made of hard stone, like chalcedony, and they were very expensive to make.
Critically, these valuable vessels stopped being manufactured around 50 AD, when they were replaced by glassware, which was cheaper and quicker to produce. So according to Beltran, the upper cup is definitely of the right design and type, from the right place and period. But trying to tie a specific object to a specific moment in history, like the Last Supper, is almost impossible.
There's no way to prove scientifically it was the cup of Christ. But what you can prove is that there is a possibility that it was used by Christ.
To try and find that proof, Janice went back to the historical context of the Last Supper. Could this have been the type of cup Jesus might have used?
Jesus was Jewish, and the chalice of the Last Supper was used for a Seder, for a Passover meal.
The Bible tells how in the last week of his life, Jesus went to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Passover. Passover is one of the most important festivals in the Jewish year. At this time, Jewish people remember how God liberated them from slavery under the pharaohs in ancient Egypt. In preparation for the Passover meal, everything must be thoroughly cleansed or koshered. Anything porous or with cavities that cannot be ritually purged isn't used. So the chalice used for wine at the Last Supper had to have been pure. This would have ruled out wood and other materials.
They also did not use a clay chalice, because clay might have had little captivities in it. They did not use silver, because silver was used for pagan coins, and you had pagan deities imprinted on it.
Stone was the obvious answer.
You find stone vessels all over the Holy Land in Jewish settlements from the time of Christ, in which they kept water for purification. So the perfect choice would have been a stone vessel. And indeed, the Holy Grail in Valencia is a stone vessel made out of beautiful agate.
It was the type of cup that would have been used at such a celebration because it was hard, it was non-porous.
But this sheer craftsmanship and quality presented an entirely new problem. How could Jesus, who famously wanted nothing to do with wealth and riches, be using such a valuable cup? Once again, Janice looked to the Bible for clues. Looking back at the accounts of the Last Supper, in the book of Mark, she discovered that the Last Supper was held in a cenacle, or dining room. And there was something unusual about this room.
According to Christians and many biblical scholars, the owner of the cenacle was a wealthy man. And we know that because it insinuates that in the Bible, that this was held in an upstairs room. There were servants present.
At that time, having a house with a first floor and servants would imply considerable wealth. If she is right, Jesus was an honored guest of a wealthy family. And on an occasion as special as Passover, it is likely that only the very best tableware would have been used.
So it was natural, because this was a very expensive cup. It would have been priceless for this family even before the Last Supper took place.
So if the upper cup was the type of cup used at the time, it begged the final question. Why had it been joined with medieval goldwork and studded with jewels? Janice discovered that embellishing relics was a popular practice in the Middle Ages.
Obviously, it stands to reason if you've got something incredibly holy, why not make it holier? I mean, you want to give people their money's worth when they come and see it, so deck it up in gold and jewels, whatever you've got to hand. There's a cynical element to that, of course. You know, it is effectively a tourist attraction. But there's also a more spiritual dimension as well. After Constantine, suddenly Christianity becomes a bit more worldly, and there's a greater sense of beauty as a spiritual path. So studying beauty would lead you to the true beauty, that is God. And Christians were quite enthusiastic about this.
But she also discovered there was a practical reason for the cup's transformation into a long-stemmed chalice.
It is easier to celebrate Mass when you have a stem to hold on to and a weighted base. There's less chance of an accident happening during the Mass. It's about spilling some of the precious blood.
For Janice, it was all making sense.
As all these pieces started coming together for me, I was really amazed by the incredible mosaic of art, culture, and history that was taking shape before my eyes.
From a valued family heirloom blessed by Jesus at the Last Supper, the Grail traveled to Rome and was used by the early popes to establish and practice the Holy Mass. During the Valerian persecutions, this same cup was bravely spirited away to northern Spain, where it had become a rallying point for Christianity. And then from the 14th century, it became a prized treasure of the kings of Aragon, before entering Valencia's cathedral in 1428, where it has remained almost ever since.
It really had all the makings of being one of the greatest stories in the history of humanity.
"11 years after first seeing the chalice, Janice was now convinced that the cup in the Cathedral of Valencia is the Holy Grail.
Really, this whole quest for me, I feel sometimes like I was led on it, that it was from something beyond me, because I have no idea how it happened.
She wrote up all her findings in the form of a book, St. Lawrence and the Holy Grail, the story of the Holy Chalice of Valencia.
It's really now for the first time that people who go to the cathedral and enter the chapel of the Holy Grail can actually appreciate the rich history of this relic, that they can understand all the sacrifices that were made by so many people throughout the centuries, that they can really comprehend all the near misses with destruction this relic has suffered throughout the years and appreciate its history more.
Of course, it is impossible to say for certain that this is the Holy Grail. There are many skeptics who are sure it isn't, and to a large degree, it comes down to circumstantial evidence.
I guess the Valencia story is as plausible as any is for the last resting place of the Holy Chalice. The problem is it has a whole bunch of weak links. We have to accept that it was kept. We have to accept that it was taken to Rome. We have to accept that the story of Lawrence taking it to Spain is actually true. And we have to accept that, well, they did manage to hang on to it in Spain for all that time. But there's nothing impossible about any of them. You know, we don't need to believe in any miracles for this to be true. So it's possible.
For the faithful, the archaeological evidence doesn't refute the authenticity of the chalice, so no one can rule it out as the Holy Grail. And there are people in Spain who certainly believe it is authentic.
So the chalice is a wonderful link with the past, in the present. It keeps tradition alive. Often it is very important in defining identity, the identity of a particular town or a church or a province. And it does help to unlock the mysteries of our faith, to bring home to people things that happened way back in the biblical past.
In more recent times, the Valencia Chalice has become more widely accepted. It seemed to have even received the endorsement of the highest Catholic authority.
In recent years, there have been 2 papal visits to Valencia.
The first was by Pope John Paul II in 1983.
He venerated the Holy Chalice, he touched it. And there's a wonderful picture of him kissing the chalice, and then a bit later he was able to use it at the celebration of Mass. And if we are to believe that this was the custom of the popes in the early centuries of the Church, then it was very much a return to papal custom, papal tradition, and the first time in over 1700 years that the Pope had used that chalice for Mass. It's nice to believe that anyway.
The second papal visit was in 2006, when Pope Benedict XVI also celebrated with the Holy Chalice.
On the square in front of the cathedral, he called it the famous relic of the Santo Chalice, which was very important because it was a recognition of the relic status. It was not only a symbol, but indeed a relic.
Pope Benedict's choice of words, this most famous chalice, from the Roman canon, seemed to support the tradition of the Holy Chalice of Valencia without actually authenticating it. But for some of the faithful, the question whether it is or isn't real doesn't matter. What is much more important is the meaning behind the quest for the Grail.
So in a way, the Holy Grail has become bigger than simply an old cup that Jesus may or may not have used at the Last Supper. It really symbolizes something at the very heart of our human life.
For people, for Christians all over the world, this represents salvation. It represents the sacrament of the Eucharist, something beyond this world, something that we can look forward to when we die, a better place where everyone will be happy.
Today, this most famous chalice remains on show in Valencia's great cathedral for all to see, a focal point for belief and worship.
We have to really admire and look at the faith of many, many generations. And in a way, the devotion of generations of Christians gives a relic a certain sanctity in itself. The fact that it's been the focus of prayer, that it's been the means of people encountering God, whether or not the relic is historically valid, that in itself gives a certain authenticity to the relic.